Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Timestamps and a full list of materials are in the description. I took this beautiful picture a few years back in Northern Ontario. So today we are going to paint a lakeside landscape using cotton paper and pulp paper. There are some major differences in how to handle these two types of paper. Knowing these differences will make it easier to successfully complete a painting. Let's start with the cotton paper, as it is easier to use and it will give me a chance to explain how to create the landscape. The pulp paper will be harder to handle and I'm concentrating on that in the second part of this video. This background will be painted using the wet in wet technique. I'm using a mop brush to apply water to the background and let it sink in for a moment. I then reapply water if needed. The goal is to get an evenly wet surface without any puddles. I previously used a pencil to draw in the horizon. The area above and below the horizon will be covered in darker paint, so this area does not need to be properly painted or look perfect. The sky has a perfect reflection in the water, so I'm painting in all my colors at the top and at the bottom of the page. I always start out with the lightest colors first and I can intensify them later if need be. I'm starting with a yellow and then I work my way down and up towards the edges of the page and I intensify my colors there. The landscape picture had a purplish sky and that contrast was only really visible when I put it on the blue background I used for this video. The sky is painted using more bluish colors, simply because it has a greater contrast with the yellow. I pre-mixed or pre-wetted all the paints I'm going to use, because I need to work pretty fast and I don't have the time to mix them when I already have a wet painting waiting for colors to be dropped in. The cotton paper stays wet longer than the pulp paper, but it still dries pretty fast and it would be leaving patterns on the page if I take too much time. If and when black watercolor should be used is a whole different discussion and there are a lot of opinions out there about it. I chose to mix it in with the blues that I'm using for the top and bottom area of the sky. Using black does not darken a color, that's not how it's used with watercolors. I personally use black as a mixing color more when it's a color that I want to add black to. So I do not use it to darken color, I use it to add black to a color. Prussian blue a lot of the times has black pigments in it, which I could technically have used, but I chose to create a cohesive painting by using turquoise instead and adding some black to the turquoise. Even though this cotton paper is on a block, so it's taped on all sides to the block of paper, it still bends a little bit and some puddles might be forming. Those puddles will leave patterns or blooms in the final painting. Since I do not want those blooms, I redistribute the pigment as long as the area is still wet. I push the pigment around with a damp brush. When doing this, I need to be careful not to have too much water in my brush, since it might cause more blooms, especially in the areas that are already drying. To make it easier, I did not use a lot of water earlier when I added the pigment from the palette. The watercolor was less diluted with water. The yellow area of the page is already dry, or too dry for the blue to bleed into it. So I use a damp brush and just redistribute the pigment, just weten it up a bit and soften my edges with it. It does leave streaks and I really like the look. The blues I'm using are staining the paper, and this paper also soaks up all the pigment in the material itself. So lifting pigment is not really an option here and it would always leave stains. So it's just easier to go in with some more pigment if you feel that something went wrong or that you're not really successful with a certain area. But I can go in with a damp brush and soften up some of those edges around the pink area of the sky. Just be careful not to add too much water to your brush or you will cause blooms. Blooms mean that if you add a drop of water to the wet pigment, it will push the pigment aside and cause a round pattern on the page. Let's paint in the mountains and the trees. I'm using lamp black for that. In order to make the painting look more cohesive, I mixed a little bit of blue into the black paint. If I wouldn't have done that, it would stick out like a sore thumb. When painting in the mountains, I'm not painting a flat black surface. There is an uneven amount of pigment in my brush and therefore the mountains appear somewhat uneven. It makes the painting look more interesting, and also the mountains do not appear to be flat black from a distance. There are some reflections of light, for example from the water. This landscape has two sets of mountains. The ones on the left are closer to me and the ones on the right are further away. So the mountains to the left that are closer to me are almost like an island. The sun is going down not at the center of this painting, but a little bit off to the right side. So the mountains to the left cast a shadow onto the water. The mountains to the right also cast a shadow onto the water. The sun is actually shining through the gap between the two mountains. So there is a lighter area and the shadow is a little further away from the mountains that are in the back. Let's move on to paint in the shadows. I'm using the same paint that I used for the mountains, but it's a little diluted, so I added some water to it. The mountains are already dry for the most part, so I do not have to be careful about not causing any bleeding. I basically drop in some watercolor closer to the mountain, wherever the shadow would be. And then I go in with a pretty wet brush and allow for the pigment to bleed into the areas that I just wetted. This gives me great control about where exactly the shadows are going to be. Also because I'm not working with a lot of water here. I work in sections to make sure that the paint is still wet enough to bleed into the wet area. If I see that any rings are forming around the area that I just wetted, I need to go in with a damp brush again and just extend the moist area a bit. While the shadow is still wet, I go in with a smaller brush which I filled with more pigment, and I go along the area where the shadow starts, like closest to the mountain, because this is where the shadow is going to be darker. So I darken it up by just adding some more pigment and letting it bleed into the rest of the shadow. All that's left to do now is to paint in some of the trees. In this season and in the area where I took the picture, it's mostly evergreens. And they are pretty easy to paint. I fill a small brush with pigment and then I just dab it on the page to create the pine cones. I'm leaving gaps between all the little dabs. The mountain area in the very back is further off in the distance, so the pines up there are even smaller. Now that everything is almost dry, I can add some last minute details. For example, the water to the right side, right in front of the mountains, has a slight blue tint, so I'm also painting that in. Of course, when I remove the tape, it rips, like it always does. I'm removing the tape and then I'm using a damp brush to soften up some of the pigment that ran under the tape, and I dab it with a paper towel to soak it up. This pigment is staining the page and it's cotton paper, so it's high quality and soaked up deep into the paper. I will not be able to remove it fully, but I can remove as much as possible. And then I'm using some white gouache to fix up some of those areas where the blue pigment is still staining the page. If there is too much blue pigment, it can mix with the acrylic paint, or if the paper is still wet, it can also mix with the acrylic paint. Let's move on to the next painting. This time I'm using pulp paper, which basically only means made from wood fibers and not cotton like the first paper. The tape I'm using does not stick to my table very well, and I want to be able to move the painting around if I need to. So I tape it onto a glass board that I have. It's actually cutting board that I bought just for this purpose. After I wetten the front of the painting, I realized that this is bulging and bending really badly. So I try to help that by also wettening the backside of the paper. Before, the paper was bulging upwards in the middle, like a balloon. Watercolor does follow the rules of gravity. So the water, along with all the pigment, would have flown off to the side of the paper. If this happens, there is absolutely no way you will be able to get the center area of the paper dark enough with enough pigment. At this point in the painting process, I realized that the tape is not sticking to the cutting board and it's not sticking to the paper as well, which means that watercolor gets under the tape. Speaking from experience, this would have happened anyways, even without me lifting it to wetten the backside of the paper. If you tape your paper to the table with really sticky tape, it will probably rip off some layers of the paint when you remove it. If the tape is not sticky enough, the problem is that the paper will not be held down by the tape, so it bulges even more. When paper gets wet, the fibers of the paper expand. And this is causing the bulging of the paper and the waviness. In general, I find a wavy paper easier to deal with than a paper that is bulging upwards in the center. This paper in general has a harder time holding a lot of pigment compared to cotton paper. This is why I went straight for Prussian blue to use towards the edges of the painting at the top and at the bottom. Prussian blue has black pigment mixed into it and is darker in general. I also use the other colors less diluted than I use them for the cotton paper. With the cotton paper, I just build up my layers and build up the intensity of the colors. I build up the intensity of my colors here as well, but the watercolor I'm using is less diluted. Like, I'm not going in with a lot more watery pigment in the first place, I just go in straight with darker and more intense colors. In general, with non-cotton paper, you need to work faster than with cotton paper because it dries faster. Disturbing the drying pigment will cause blooms or some weird patterns on your final painting. I have 1,000 puddles to deal with because the paper is so wavy. I sometimes even soak them up with a paper towel to dry out an area and make sure that no more pigment can run into this area. Watercolor will only bleed into wet areas. The watercolor is also getting under the tape, pooling there. I push it out of that pocket with my fingers and then I use my brush to redistribute it on the page. Do you remember the large brush I used at the very beginning to wetten the page? Well, it left a lot of bristles on the page, which I didn't see at first. They are almost white. During the painting process, after I added the blue pigment, I could see some of them and I picked out as many of them as I could. Well, some of them remained on the paper and they did leave some streaks and kind of funny patterns on the paper. I don't mind at all. The paint I use is Prussian blue and that is a granulating paint, which means that it dries uneven and the pigment tends to form clusters. This leaves structures on the paper. So the pattern from the bristles work well with the overall look of the painting. When I paint in the mountains, I'm not using straight black out of the tube. I'm mixing in some blue to create a more cohesive painting. I first paint in the mountains and then I paint in some evergreens. The evergreens do not require a lot of details. I fill my brush with some pigment and I just dab it on the page. If an area somehow looks off, I add some more ground covers, like some more bushes. This will tie the trees into the landscape and make the whole painting look more cohesive. I'm using the same technique to paint in the shadows that I used earlier with the cotton paper. The difference here is that it dries faster, but it is also easier to lift some pigment. I fill my brush with a diluted version of the black mix I used for the mountains, and I get some of that pigment on the page where I want the shadows to be. Next, I use a wet brush to touch the areas where I just added the pigment. This makes the pigment flow into the damp areas. And remember, it's easier to make a shadow larger than it is to take some pigment away. Lifting pigment from the shadow would also take away some of the blue pigment I added earlier for the water. While the shadow is still wet, I add some more pigment to the area where the shadow meets the rock to darken it up. This pigment bleeds into the wet shadow, creating a soft edge. Just to demonstrate how easy it is to lift the pigment on this type of paper, I let the shadow on the right side dry. And I'm going in with a damp brush and a lot of water, like not puddling water, but quite a bit of water. And I just re-wetten the pigment and I can move it around. Sometimes you have to change plans. Removing the tape, I discover how much pigment actually made its way under the tape. So I'm just cutting off the border. I wanted to have a white border. Well, changing plans, I'm not going to have a white border. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. Please let me know what you thought in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. And I hope to see you soon with another video.